thank you for the hardcore who came out here to hear about housing this morning. I've been in the housing business over 45 years, and what I'm inclined to say is that I've never seen a housing crisis in this country as bad as that exists today. It's hard for the 2/3 of Americans who can afford their rents and their mortgages to really recognize the dilemma that 1/3 of our citizens have. So when we had a chance to do this main program here at ULI, we decided to kind of focus on it in a national context, although with Renee and Daryl and the governor, we've got a lot of people who have worked on housing at the local and state level, so we'll touch base on that as well. So we have in this country about 125 million households. 63.7%, according to the latest stats, are homeowners, and the balance are renters. But the renters, as you might guess, make about half of what the homeowners make. And as the country has recovered from the Great Recession, it's been very uneven. You all know the stats. Lower income people just have not advanced at all. In the meantime, housing that's being built these days is more and more expensive. I tell people in the Southeast, where Peter Pappas and I are building some suburban garden apartments, that the cheapest apartment we can build is $160,000 per unit, and that half the country can't afford that. Doug Bibby from National Multi-Housing Council says we're losing 125,000 affordable rental units every year. And we have only one production program of any consequence, that's the low-income housing tax credit. That builds about 50,000 new units, targeted at people making 60% of area median income. So we're going backwards. We've talked with Speaker Ryan about his anti-poverty program. I think it's fair to say that the United States has the worst poverty housing situation in the first world. And we have a national policy, but it's an old policy that's, in my opinion, way out of date. We had, with my foundation in New Hampshire, we had a housing forum. We had 7 presidential candidates. One of the things that Pam Patnode and I and our advisory board have been trying to do, Scott Brown has been great in terms of having backyard barbecues for all the presidential candidates coming through on the Republican side, is to make them aware of what is going on in this country and to try and get the presidential candidates to talk about housing. It's really very hard to get done. So we have a situation where 1 out of 6 American families spend more than half their income on housing. 50% of renters spend more than 30% of their income on housing. That leaves them very little for the other necessities of life. We are advocates of a lot more affordable housing being built, whether it's ownership or rental, but the tsunami of demand is in rental. It's an interesting stat. Carol Galante, the former FHA commissioner, who's now out at Cal Berkeley, said to us recently, there are no more homeowners in this country today than there were 10 years ago. As you all probably know, about 7 million families were foreclosed on, have not returned to the ownership ranks. So now 1/3 of our rental housing is single family. Families want to rent single family homes. That's really hard to come by. We have no production program for that. That's just older housing that investors are owning and will rent to families who want a home, not an apartment. So we have a situation that's deteriorating. Exacerbating the problem is that somewhere around 80%, 4 out of 5 new households are minority, led by Latinos and secondly African Americans. And Latino and African American incomes tend to be significantly lower than non-Hispanic white incomes or Asian American incomes. So the idea that they'll become homeowners, while an aspirational goal for virtually all of them, is in fact going to be challenging. Their homeownership rates are currently in the mid to low 40s. I was talking with Dave Stevens of the mortgage bankers the other day about where home ownership rates are going to go. They've fallen from 69.2 to 63.7. According to the Urban Institute, they're going to continue to fall towards 60%. And every 1% fall is 1.2 million households. So while the percentages moving don't seem that big, there are a lot of people involved in that. One production program, the low-income housing tax credit. Otherwise, we're left to try and preserve. And you'll hear from Daryl and our panel today about some of the efforts that are being undertaken to preserve existing rental housing. But it's really tough. And we've been involved in something called How Housing Matters at Enterprise, and Enterprise Community Partners, incidentally, which I think is maybe the largest nonprofit affordable housing advocate. I'm a chairman of that. We have a project, we have a campaign called Make Room, to acknowledge that more than 11 million renters spend over half their income on housing. So we're all trying to figure out what policy solutions to advocate for. The 1949 Housing Act set an aspirational goal for the United States that every American family have an affordable home in a suitable location. The location is important too, because if we're going to talk about helping people come out of poverty, their children have to be able to get to a decent school. Raj Chetty has recently done some research, a researcher from Harvard, on the importance of families growing up in middle-income neighborhoods and how the outcomes for those children, whether it's educational outcomes or job outcomes, are different. So since Speaker Ryan has a real anti-poverty program, what we're trying to do is convince him and others that having a simple, decent, affordable home is foundational. There's not any way kids are going to have good educational outcomes. People are going to be able to get to work, to decent grocery stores, to health care, if they don't have an affordable home. And it's consuming so much of the income. There's a new book out called Evicted. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. Those of us in the housing space have heard of it now, which is tracking what's happening to families in rental housing when they're paying 70 and 80% of their income for housing and they miss a payment. And it's so unstable. So if our country is getting more and more diverse and 80% of household growth is minority, I would argue we need to do something to change that trajectory. We should, I think, follow the 1949 Housing Act's aspirational goal to make housing a priority. We couldn't successfully get politicians to talk about it. I am delighted to say that Secretary Clinton and now Bernie Sanders both now at least have some housing platform for us to talk about. We're really trying hard now to, when we get a platform for the candidates that ultimately surface, look like they're surfacing now, to get them to put housing on their platform, because it's just not a very comfortable thing for politicians to deal with. I've been to Congress talking to the senators and congressmen for the last 2 years. They're really not aware of this crisis. We call it the silent housing crisis. They're not very much aware of it. And we argue that housing matters, that there is a crisis, and that it's hurting the economy of the United States. These young people coming up who are unable to get a decent education, who are in poverty, are not going to become productive citizens. They're going to become welfare recipients, and there's something we should do about it. So today in the United States, it was interesting to me when we had our housing forum in New Hampshire. 2 of the 7 presidential candidates thought that the federal government had no role in housing. And I don't know what you all think about it. I mean, it's a responsibility, I think, at every level of government, clearly, and we're going to talk some about that today, what can be done locally and at the state level. But today in the United States, we spend $200 billion a year on housing subsidy. And as I said earlier, you need subsidy to build something affordable, because construction costs and land costs are so high that the market rate people can't provide affordable rental housing. So we need a subsidy. It can come in the way of subsidizing new construction, which is what the low-income housing tax credit does, or it can come in subsidies by giving vouchers to individuals or finding some other way to help supplement their income. Today, of the $200 billion we spend, 3/4 of it goes to home ownership. Even though homeowners make twice as much as renters, 3/4 of the subsidy, and it comes through the tax code, mortgage interest deductions being the biggest part of it, state and local property tax deductions, capital gains exclusions. But you have to itemize to take the mortgage interest deduction. Only 30% of American families itemize. So most of the people who need it aren't really getting the help. And on the rental side, where there is desperate and growing need, only 1 out of 4 people who are eligible for support get it, because there's only $50 billion available. I say only. Sounds like a lot of money, but it's not at all nearly covering what the demand is. So what we are in my foundation advocating is that we recalibrate where we spend our money in this country, that we find different ways to incent home ownership. Right now, we're having a whole lot of trouble getting people into home ownership because rents have risen so much that people can't save for a down payment. Restrictions are tougher on who can qualify. And I think what we should, as a nation, aspire to is having every family who wants to be a sustainable homeowner have that opportunity. But they need a hand, and the mortgage interest deduction and state and local property tax deductions, I would argue, are not giving them the help that they need. So we're in a dilemma, and we're trying to elevate this issue, trying to tell people there's a silent housing crisis in this country, and we all have a vested interest in doing something about it. So for this program today, I invited 4 people who share my sense of urgency about this issue. 2 of them, Scott Brown and Renee Glover, are on our advisory board of my foundation. Daryl has just joined the advisory board of the Terwilliger Center, which focuses on workforce housing here at ULI. So I'm going to introduce who they are, and then I'll go sit and ask some questions, and hopefully at the end of the session, you guys will have some questions, and you can come up. There's mics here on either side, and I hope we'll have some time for questions. So Senator Scott Brown, who is right there in the red tie, won a special U.S. Senate election in 2010 in Massachusetts. He is the first Republican senator elected in 50 years in Massachusetts. Served on the Armed Services Committee, Homeland Security, Government Affairs, and the Committee on Small Business. He's one of the most bipartisan senators in the Senate, was responsible for many pieces of important legislation in his stay there. Held the rank of colonel in the Army and recently retired after 35 years of service. Senator Brown lived in 17 different homes growing up and was able to get to college on a basketball scholarship. So he's got quite a story and has quite a sense of understanding of the dilemma people feel when they don't have a stable home. He's a frequent contributor on TV and radio, a New York Times best-selling author, and you'll see him on Fox frequently. So thank you, Senator Brown, for being here. Governor O'Malley, over here in the blue tie, is, as you all may know, highly successful 2-time mayor of Baltimore and 2-time governor of Maryland. Time magazine named Mayor O'Malley one of America's top 5 big city mayors. Under his leadership, Maryland recovered 100% of the jobs lost during the national recession and was one of only 7 states to maintain a AAA bond rating. From 2011 to 2013, Governor O'Malley was the chair of the Democratic Governors Association, and in 2016, as you all know, he was a candidate for the Democratic Party nomination for president. Renee Glover, on my left here, is the founder and managing member of Catalyst Group, a national consulting firm focused on urban revitalization, real estate development, and community building. Renee served as the president and chief executive officer of the Atlanta Housing Authority for almost 20 years. I have had the pleasure of working with Renee for a long time. She turned around one of the worst housing authorities in the country into an exemplary housing authority, sponsoring 16 master-planned mixed-use, mixed-income communities with private sector real estate developers, partnered with her, leveraging $300 million of federal funds into over $3 billion of private investment, taking the Hope 6 projects and really converting all the public housing in Atlanta in a very respectable mixed-income communities. Currently, she serves on the board of Fannie Mae, Enterprise Community Partners, and the University of Pennsylvania's Urban Institute for Urban Research. She also just finished serving a decade on Habitat's board, where she retired as board chair just last year. Last but not least, Daryl Carter, founder, chairman, and CEO of Avenanth, is a Southern California-based investment fund. Over the last 2 years, they have acquired in excess of $300 million in affordable apartments nationwide. Daryl is one of the heroes out there that's helping to acquire affordable apartments and keep them preserved for affordable units for families. Prior to that, he was executive managing director of Centerline Capital Group, co-chairman of Capri Capital Advisors. He is a trustee, former chairman, just retired of the National Multi-Housing Council, the largest apartment group in the U.S., and past chairman of the Commercial Board of Governors of the Mortgage Bankers Association. So please welcome these four to the stage here for us. Okay, am I live?
You are.
I'm live. Okay, what we thought we'd do as to format is I would ask each of them a question and get a response. You've got their backgrounds now, so you're getting a perspective from people from different parties, different parts of the country, and in different venues, different endeavors now. So, Senator Brown, I'll start with you. In your opinion, do we need a national housing policy? And if so, what should the main goals be?
Well, first of all, Ron, thank you for allowing me to speak, and all of you, thanks for muscling out of bed and coming down and listening to us. This is a very important issue for me and everybody up here, and I'm presuming for you because you're here. Yes, of course, we need a federal housing policy. As you referenced, we spend over $200 billion plus on federal housing issues, related issues right now. It's old and outdated. We need to, obviously, as a Republican, one of the things I want to do is make sure we maximize the amount of dollars that the federal government gets, make sure we utilize them and use them well. And so that top to bottom review is very much appropriate in my eyes on every part of the federal government. As you know, we're in almost $20 trillion of national debt, so every dollar that these agencies or departments have is valuable. And in order to find a way to reduce our national debt, you're going to have some changes if, in fact, we do what we need to do, which is to get a budget and stick to it. So a lot of the arguments that we're having now is to find out, well, if in fact we find savings, does that go to paying down the debt, or is it going to stay within that department to be reallocated properly? And whenever I look at any federal issue, I look at, well, how many jobs can we create? Can we actually create jobs? Can we put people in housing? Because I believe the first goal is to promote first-time home ownership. The second is to make rental housing more affordable. And if you can hit those two goals, then you're doing really well. And as Ron referenced, I lived in 17 houses by the time I was 18. My mom was on welfare. My mom had 2 or 3 jobs, a lot of violence and other stuff in our family. So housing, for me, you say, well, why is Scott involved in housing? It's because it's personal. I lived it, and I understand how important it is to have a safe, affordable home where you can keep that family unit together. I find there's an incredible amount of overregulation in this field. Regulation after regulation after regulation, which actually is not allowing people to actually get mortgages. And then people like Ron and others like you who are out trying to build these affordable housing units, the red tape is unbelievable. And by the time you walk in the door, that so-called affordable unit is maybe affordable in California, New York, Boston, but it's not in the heartland of our country. So there's a lot that needs to be done. We know the problems. That's why I'm on the board with Ron, trying to find different solutions, trying to work with members of Congress, trying to get that conversation in the scrum of the political season right now. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Scott has been wonderful in getting to particularly all the Republican candidates and at least letting them know about our concern about the housing circumstances. Governor O'Malley was nice enough to be one of the 7 presidential candidates who met with our housing summit in New Hampshire. And as I referenced earlier, Governor, a couple of the candidates said, I think the federal government has no role in housing in the U.S., which I assume they didn't know we were spending $200 billion, is what I assumed. What do you think about the federal role? But as importantly, since you've been a mayor and a governor, what do you think the responsibilities at the local and state level are for housing our citizens?
I think it's a tremendous opportunity for us to actually do things that work in order to confront the biggest challenge we face as a people, and that is a shrinking middle class. For many years, we agreed as a people that in order to grow our middle class, we also needed to make our country stronger, and that required certain rungs on the ladder, if you will, to economic success for every family. And one of those is affordable, decent housing, whether at the rental level, home ownership. And for many years, we created those rungs on the ladder that allowed people to succeed, that helped to grow our middle class. And we've gotten away from that. The good news is we still know what works. And what we were able to do in our state, even during the recession, was to be able to put together the precious consensus to actually make the public investments on the state level that allowed us to leverage up a lot of investment dollars so that we could create more units of affordable rental housing. In fact, during my 8 years in service to the people of Maryland, we hit a record, even with the recession, we hit a record in terms of the number of new units that we were able to construct. And even with tight budgets, I was able to keep the consensus together that drew, frankly, Republican and Democratic support around the initiative where we would allocate a certain amount of state dollars, and then those that were adept at developing these units were able to leverage those up into many, many more. So I believe when you had your presidential candidates, Ron, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I was the only Democratic candidate for president.
You were. We weren't able to get Secretary Clinton or Mr. Sanders.
But let me tell you the good news. It's been my experience that they generally eventually come around to my policy papers.
I said they do have housing platforms.
It's good, and I bet they look a lot like mine, but not as good.
We're waiting for Mr. Trump to come out. I know with Scott's help, he will get there too.
One of the more enjoyable parts of running for president was the ability to give voice to important issues like the issues of affordable housing. And I believe the key here is to empower our cities. And so I advocated that we triple, actually, the low-income housing tax credits, and that we double community development block grant funding.
You're a man after my own heart.
And that we wrap this in the mission of growing our middle class, restoring those rungs to the ladder of opportunity, and actually putting people to work. And I think if we do that, there's actually broad consensus across the country.
Yeah, thank you very much. The governor mentioned the Republicans and Democrats working together. We think this is a nonpartisan issue that needs bipartisan support. And we're trying to establish in the minds of the people who can do something about it at all levels, but speaking at the national level, that there is a crisis, that housing matters, and that there is a way to address it that this country can afford. I'm going to next go to Renee Glover. I told you earlier she was a fabulous housing authority person. Atlanta was about to be taken over when 1994, I think it was, Renee, when she took over as housing authority director. So Renee, more than any of us here, I think, has the hands-on, in the community feel for what works. She's been a real advocate for moving to work. So Renee, my question for you is, having worked at the local level, how important can local housing authorities be in serving their citizens, and how important a role can the mayor or city officials play in making it happen at the city level?
Well, clearly these are very important issues, and I think about housing policy really occurring at the federal, state, and local levels. And if you think about it, policy, as well as the money that follows the policy, should drive outcomes. And so as cities compete for companies to come and establish their headquarters there, if you think about what really works, the employers are looking for safety, security, great affordable housing. And affordable housing is really an asset if you think about it. I think often it's been mispositioned because people think about affordable housing as being something that is a handout as opposed to a resource in order to achieve the great outcomes that we want. People want walkable cities, they want great amenities, and so part of having great affordable housing is really a competitive advantage for cities. And the question is, how can we learn from past best practices and lessons learned so that we can create healthy cities? And the reason that mayors and local officials are so important is that they are on the ground, and if America is going to keep its competitive edge, we've got to have great cities that offer the types of opportunities that are needed. So what we've learned over the last 10, 15 years is that we can now abandon the practice of concentrating families in poverty because we know it doesn't work. And so we can move away from that. We have learned how to do it. And so I would challenge this audience to think about, as you are creating community, you're creating communities of opportunity. So if America's going to keep its competitive edge, we've got to have great schools. Not just good schools, but great schools. Because the workforces that we need today are not the workforces that we had yesterday. And so housing policy and education policy are codependent, because just like you can't overcome the externalities of concentrating families in poverty situations as far as housing, similarly, we have created poverty situations in our schools. So as we create these mixed-use, mixed-income communities, we're solving both the housing issues as well as the education issues. So this is really about, how is America going to keep its competitive edge? And so I know many of you are developers competing to do work in cities and local government, and what is needed is innovation, and what the government can do at the federal, state, and local level is harmonize the policies so that we can get the regulatory burden down. And I think that that can occur. I think that's something that we should be doing to be competitive in the world. And we have to recognize that regulations are not about means and method. They really are about outcomes. So getting rid of concentrations of poverty, making sure that we are inclusive, making sure that no one has to commute, because we need to form communities like we form great companies, which is all levels up and down the economic spectrum, and that will help position us to be a great nation going way into the future.
Thank you, Renee. Regulation continues to come up, doesn't it? We did something here with our housing center called bending the cost curve, just to try to get at some of the cost of regulation in construction new housing. I'm going to come to Daryl now. Daryl grew up in Detroit. I think his father was in the automotive industry. I think some of us on the stage here probably got to college with basketball. He played at Michigan. It just shows you, if you have decent public schools, that gives us an opportunity to get up and create a great life, and sports help the three of us. Daryl, I talked a little bit about where home ownership is. You know, people talk about the American dream as being a homeowner. I think the American dream is what's happened to you and Scott and I and everybody on this stage, where we were able to take advantage of the free enterprise system and the opportunities that this great country gave us. I'd like you to talk about home ownership in rental. We know there were 6 or 7 million foreclosures, so a lot of people who were homeowners, but unsustainable homeowners, are no longer. They're renting single-family homes, I think, largely, as I mentioned. And yet the dream is still there. It's just a question of whether they can get there. So how do you think about home ownership versus rental?
Well, I would say that the first thing, we are in the rental housing business, and we acquire, when Ron talked about the economics of building new, and the fact that, when you look at the fact we do lose about 125,000 units a year, our strategy is to reclaim some of those and renew them. Now, many of them are in locations that are, sometimes people have kind of given up on, and we've reclaimed great properties that were underinvested in places like Long Beach, California, West Oakland in California. But when you look at our most successful communities, I think two things. One is they tend to be in locations where there is a variety of different types of housing for a variety of different incomes. I think, we have a community that's in Natomas, which is a section of Sacramento. It's located in an area where there are, our property is a 40% Section 8, 60% market rate. It's about a 230 unit property. We're surrounded by some market rate apartments. We also have single family homes. So it's a real balanced community. And in many respects, I look at my upbringing in Detroit, and there was a time, and this is perhaps a little politically incorrect to say, but one of the things when I grew up in Detroit, where before the days of fair housing, in the African American community on the west side of Detroit, you had a variety of incomes. My physician lived a few blocks from us. The person who owned the meat market lived also. There was one street where very affluent African Americans lived, and then there were, where the auto workers lived. And then I remember when they built a very large, one of the first housing projects, the Jeffrey Housing Projects. They were very nice, and people rented there, but it was all a community, and it was highly aspirational. My dad would say, you want to eventually move on that street. And so that model of mixed income, I think really, really works. And I think it solves some of the affordability challenges. And as Renee said, we've gotten into this mode of sort of concentrating affordable residents, when in reality, what will lift everyone up is to have highly, much more diverse communities. Certainly it would be great racially, but more importantly, income-wise, because I think, there is greater political leverage that community has if it's diverse from an income standpoint. So I believe, our best communities are those that coexist with a variety of different housing types, including home ownership.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. The mix is changing, the aspirational goals are there, but having mixed income communities and giving every family a chance, giving them a hand up, giving them an opportunity, as we say at Enterprise, moving to opportunity. Senator Brown, I'm going to come back to you next. So you were great in having your backyard barbecues, and we got to talk to most all of the Republican candidates, and we wanted, the debates to have housing questions, and we were unsuccessful at getting that. And I'm just wondering why you think housing is pretty much been ignored by the candidates, at least in terms of their talking, but it's also fairly well not anything much going on in Congress. The president doesn't speak about it. Why is that? Why is it so hard to get politicians to focus on housing?
Well, first of all, for those of you, Ron keeps referring to these barbecues. We had, it was my wife's idea. We called it the No BS Backyard Barbecue, and spent about $30,000 in hot dogs and beer. And people like you would come and grab a lawn chair, and literally, there's the candidate right there. And we had anyone, for Lindsey Graham and Pataki, we had 100 people. For Trump, we had almost 2,000. So this is in my backyard, really very informal, the typical New Hampshire way, where you literally grill the candidates, and if they don't give you a good answer, you keep going right after them, unfiltered, no boundaries, and it was really fascinating to see them. I knew them all. We were able to have 10 of them to our home. The other ones, basically, it was a scheduling issue. And it was fascinating to watch the interaction. And the first question, being the host, I was able to ask about housing, pointing out, you know, what's your position, where do you stand, reflecting on my position on housing. And everybody, so as a result of that, we were able to get it in the scrum. It got picked up by the newspaper. We had it on YouTube and videoed, and we pushed it out in our foundation.
Right.
And being on the executive board here, my former colleagues and Ron also goes and speaks to our colleagues like, hey, what's the housing policy? And I'll be respectfully honest to my Democratic friends here, this administration has missed an amazing opportunity over the last 8 years to address a lot of these issues. And that's unfortunate. So I think the leadership on this issue from the president on down has been severely lacking. And then you have Fannie and Freddie right now. They've been under conservatorship for, what, 8 years? And, you know, that's about to blow up. And if that does, then you're going to see, I think, another, especially if they come and ask for another drawdown of taxpayer funds, it's going to be a real problem, especially with the $20 trillion of national debt. So it is out there, but then you say, well, how come it isn't talked about? Well, because we are in the middle of a political season that's unlike any political experience I've ever seen or anyone that you know has ever seen. We have ISIS. We've got, you know, what's happening on our borders. You have so many other things that are consuming people. And when folks, unless you're living it, and when you think about, you know, the top few issues, you're like, okay, border security and national security, obviously, foreign policy, jobs in the economy, Obamacare, those pretty much are the top 5. And housing's probably way down here. So it's been our job to kind of talk about it. That's why you're here. Because when you have 50% of someone's income or higher, in New Hampshire it's 50%. So every paycheck you get, you make $1,000, 500 of that's going to housing, and the rest you're living on. It's pretty intense. And so our job has been trying to figure out solutions. You know, it's easy to identify the problems, but what are the solutions? The solutions are, I think, are dealing with the public-private partnership aspect of it. And when I say public-private, I'm talking state, federal, and local, city and town working together. So those three, as well as people like Darryl coming in and working together and maximizing those dollars, creating jobs, creating opportunities, creating these wonderful either rehabbed, reclamation of old projects or starting new projects where you have the mixed use, mixed income, racially mixed that actually kind of set a new trend of affordable housing. I don't think it's going to be coming up until after the conventions are over and after we have a nominee and a new president, whether it's whoever it's going to be, for people like you and us to go in and really try to get in on the convention platform, but also after the fact in their transition team. I think that's the key.
Thank you, Senator. It's interesting and frustrating to me. I've been Habitat for Humanity's Global Campaign Chair for essentially the last 10 years. And when you ask philanthropists their priorities, it's always health and education, and then it goes to the arts. And housing is, just as the senator said, housing is buried down here somewhere, but it's so fundamental. Food, clothing, and shelter, basic human needs. Governor O'Malley, kind of same question. You were out, you know, talking to people all over the country. Did anybody ask about housing? You know, I talked to Governor Huckabee, and he says, well, the constituents don't ask me. So did you get any questions or concerns about housing out there? And like I asked Senator Brown, what do you think how do we get something done at the federal level to supplement what we can do local and state level?
Yeah, you had to listen carefully when people would ask about housing, because usually it came in the context of, I'm working harder, but I'm falling further behind.
Yeah.
And then you would have to tease out, giving the person some, and the great thing about New Hampshire and Iowa is, I mean, there are real conversations that take place, you know, and so once you'd listen to people, the definition of falling further behind, not surprisingly, is that I'm working harder, but my dollars are going to the essentials, and there's less and less left. And one of the big essentials, of course, is housing. So it would come up, but it would come up within that context. And quite honestly, Ron, the great anxiety on the table of our democracy, if you will, is that we're all working harder. 70% of us are earning the same or less than we were 10 or 12 years ago. And the question is, what do we do about it? People tend to look down at their shoes when they face the prospect that their children might not enjoy lives with as much opportunity as they have enjoyed. So that's the context in which it came up. I mean, we could probably have a longer conversation for another time about how we restore some better format and substance to our presidential debates. I mean, sometimes it felt like the networks wanted to just turn us into ants in a jar that they could shake up and watch us attack one another instead of talking about more substantive issues. But I think what we need to do in order to lift this is people tend to regard infrastructure as a for granted. And the built environment, especially where affordable housing comes into play, I think is one of those things like bridges and roads that people put into the, well, that's what government does, that's a for granted, and that's something that we just have. But no nation, I mean, these things don't build themselves. Bridges don't become stronger with age, and you don't get more affordable housing units by cutting your government. So we need to make the investments, and we need to make the argument for making those investments. And I think it all has to come back to the actions that we must take to grow our middle class. And housing is certainly one of those things, and affordable housing. I mean, and we have to make the links between having affordable housing when you're starting a family, whether it's rental or what have you, allows you then to save the dollars to go to home ownership in the next rung.
Right, and that is one of the dilemmas, is that because incomes have stagnated and rents continue to go up, the opportunity to save for that down payment is really frustrating, and then you've got student loans, so you've got a lot of factors now.
And it's easy to say, and we've done and there's been a very good job done of framing it in such a way that taxes are the one thing we can control that's coming out of your pocket and making it harder for you to get ahead. Well, actually, that's not true. The taxes going up as a percentage of a family's budget is not the driver. It's the other things you mentioned. It's the cost of housing. It's the cost of education. These are the costs that are going up, and the solution is not to do less about those things. It's to invest more.
So we're down to about 10 minutes. I'm hoping to get some questions, but I want to get back to Renee and Daryl just to finish up. Renee, I know I teased out with you how kind of the local and the federal and the state all can work together, and if you have, as I ask each of you to think about one big idea what we could be doing differently. So let me give it to you for a few minutes, and then we'll finish with Daryl. And if any of you have questions out there, there are 2 mics, and we'd love to entertain them until we run out of time.
Well, I would simply say cities are back. This whole phenomenon of urbanization is real. And so I really want to challenge this community that's focused on community building and housing to look at ways where we can have effective public-private partnerships where we are actually developing economically integrated communities. I think that a lot of the things that constrained us in the past are behind us, and often our policies lag maybe 20, 30, 40 years, and we need to put that foolishness aside, because the good news is we know what to do, and the question is, with cities coming back and density being with us, how can we together create these exciting communities where the millennials are going to live? Everybody wants to be in the urban core, and we can't leave anyone out, because this is not just a matter of finding housing for the poor. This is really about maintaining the competitive edge of the United States as a global power. And I think the issue that every country in the world, I had a marvelous time traveling throughout the world, and most countries are grappling with the issue of what are we going to do about our slums. We have concentrated poverty because of old legacy issues. The United States had concentrated poverty because of old legacy issues. Well, guess what? Our young folks, the millennials, are saying, that's not my issue. I love diversity. I love the creativity of it, the innovation of it. So how can we challenge ourselves to leverage the new world and get out of all of the old past battles and create healthy, vibrant communities where we can get education right. For God's sake, we've been working on education now for 50 years. Let's get over it, truly educate our folks, celebrate diversity, celebrate innovation, and I think if we can do that and come together as a country and not be fighting old battles, we will be a great country of the future for centuries.
Thank you, Renee. And like Renee, I have had the pleasure working with Habitat of seeing housing all across the world. It's interesting. In some countries, the national government takes a very active role. Sometimes they subsidize mortgage rates. Sometimes they provide land. It's different across the world. And Daryl, let me just ask you, I mentioned earlier the 1949 Housing Act set aspirational goals for our country. I believe them, I'm not sure how many people do, that every American family have an affordable home in a decent location. Is that still relevant? That's a long time ago. And actually, you know, we're certainly not progressed to meet that goal. Is that still a relevant goal for us?
I think it's a relative goal, Ron. I also think, and I'd like to maybe focus on two things that our industry can do. I mean, forget government for a second and say, what can we in the room do? I would say two things. One is we really need to examine what I call this value-added arms race, meaning where we have developers who buy C properties that want to make them A properties and then make them non-affordable. I mean, we do that business. We acquire Cs, we make them to very nice Bs. And so, you know, we don't necessarily get rid of the popcorn ceiling that some of our investors say, wow, that ceiling's really ugly. I said, well, if I remove it, it's $50 more in rent I have to charge. And everybody can now afford a big screen TV at $300, so they're not looking at the ceiling. So one of the things that this room needs to do is to do smarter rehabs, because we found that if we can do a smarter rehab, we have much more demand. And this, you know, we also have to watch the optics of what we say in this room. And you know, NMHC, National Multifamily Housing Council, you know, we'll have developers say, look, we're acquiring this and we're going to upgrade it and we're going to turn over the tenant base 65 to 70%. Well, when you think about it, if you live in a nice place in Newport Beach, Scarsdale, New York, or wherever, and you say, okay, how would you feel if your neighborhood changed 65% every year? You wouldn't like it. Maybe a few of my neighbors, but not 65%. So but the other thing that in order for what we do in the communities that we serve, in both what we rehab and develop and manage, our organization looks like those communities, okay? Unfortunately, this room does not look like the communities that we serve. I mean, so we have to bring much greater diversity in this industry to address some of these challenges of serving diverse communities.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? You know, if you just go to the mic and address them to any particular person you want, or we'll pick someone.
Good morning. Doug Hamilton with Archelia Architecture in New York. One of the themes of the conversation this morning has been the importance of mixed income communities. In New York, we just lost an important tool to create those mixed income communities in the 421A program, which exchanged 20 years of property tax breaks for 20% affordable housing in new rental projects. There's a debate ongoing now as to what is going to replace that program. I wanted to find out if you folks at the table know of specific programs elsewhere in this country or in other countries that have been effective in creating the incentives to create mixed affordable income communities.
What was the reason they did away with it?
It's complicated, but some of it had to do with the cost of labor. There's an ongoing debate in New York right now about how much union labor is contributing to the cost of housing. Land costs have been escalating. I think there are critics of the program that kind of wanted to see it sunset. And there just has not been a political consensus built about what should replace it at this point.
But the notion of the program was that it allowed for a kind of a tax incremental financing for affordable units?
It was property tax breaks for new construction. Basically, the affordable component could have been satisfied in one of two ways. You either provide 20% affordable housing within the project itself, or there were vouchers that were available that you could trade for affordable housing on other properties that were being developed elsewhere in the city.
Interesting.
We had a conference last week in Atlanta with Ron, and we sat down. We had various roundtables, all the heavy hitters in that region, Renee included, sitting down, figuring out, well, what are some of the programs like you're referring to? That's a parochial program for New York, I'm presuming, obviously. And the biggest challenge was, the cost of purchasing the property. Then you have the offset cost mitigation, union labor versus, just going out and getting the best price. And the general consensus from Renee and me is, you got to deregulate, you have to streamline, you have to consolidate, you got to make it attractive, and you have to create a value for those tax dollars to the citizens of New York. The politicians are looking at it and say, yeah, we're not getting that value anymore. That's more than likely why it went away. Obviously, it's at the legislative level, the governor level, in New York in particular. So we found in our presentation that each state has little parochial types of problems, and that's why we're here. That's why we're involved with Ron to try to come up with a federal policy that the states can marry up with. And what I have found is the biggest, and Darrell may say this, is the public-private partnerships with the LIHTC, with a lot of the offsets that you receive from your communities. And unfortunately, it starts at the legislative level and the governor level in New York, and I don't have any solutions for New York.
Are you aware of?
Well, I was going to mention tax allocation districts with the tax increment financing have been very effective, and it incents public-private partnerships, helps get the costs down, provides cost of public infrastructure, down payment assistance programs. So what I would urge is that there is a lot of wonderful research growing out of many of these programs. I think Hope 6 was tremendously effective, and it enjoyed bipartisan support. And the interesting thing is when it was most effective was when it wasn't a prescription book. It was really a concept. It was seed dollars that encouraged innovation. It encouraged leveraging resources, and it paid for those costs that were not financeable. And for a period from 1992, when it was first authorized, up until 2009, it was always, monies were always appropriated, and it always incented at least 10 times leverage and had a multiplier effect. So there are a lot of really good programs that are out there, and I think to support the political pushback that often occurs, we have to put our data and lessons learned and research done by the economists and schools and universities to support these programs, because we're not going to get there without the subsidies. But again, moving more to outcomes versus an how-to manual that ends up killing off things and driving the costs.
One thing, we got time for one more question. I think there's a young lady behind you. The Terwilliger Center for Housing at ULI, Stockton Williams, is sitting in the front here. We're trying to be a resource for ULI, particularly district councils, for ideas that work in trying to create more or preserve more affordable rental housing. So don't hesitate to reach out to Stockton. I'll volunteer you to Stockton.
So bottom line is, nothing's going to happen. You're going to lose that credit. And you're not going to build affordable housing. You're going to go into the retail market and just go and make as much money as you possibly can. And so how do you address that? Well, you're going to have to get political. You're going to have to get, whether it's lobbyists or your group, you're in New York, going to have to go and actually point out to the politicians, hey, by the way, we're losing all these housing units, point out what the problems are, and try to reestablish a program that's similar. That's the only way you're going to get back in the game in New York.
Yes, ma'am. Last question.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Roz Clemens, and I'm with Prince George's County, Maryland. I think for this affordable housing issue to really be addressed, it has to be supported at the federal, state, as well as the local level. And on the local level is where you tend to have the most resistance and the least capacity to address this in terms of density, in terms of incentives. So what can we do so that we can, at that local level, build that capacity? You have some exciting cities and communities that are doing great things with zoning, with set-aside units, with density bonuses for creating affordable housing, because they're cutting edge, they're doing the best practices. But then there are many communities that don't have this type of capacity. So what can we do at the national and state level to incentivize or to build this affordable housing best practice at the local level? Thank you.
I'm going to take a stab at it. I think about what we're doing right now in Long Beach, California, which is probably somewhat similar to Prince George's County. And, you know, we have a tremendous mayor in that city who has been very proactive in, you know, we bought a very large 528 unit Section 8 property that we've renovated. And ultimately, because of what we were doing, there was great value created in that area, and we had an issue with the property next to us. There were lots of things that impacted our property, and the mayor said, well, why don't you just buy it? And we eventually did. And then when we bought the second property, which was 375 units, we looked at also making that affordable, and he said no. He said, let's make it mixed income, gave us some benefits to doing that because it was already a market rate property. But the other thing, work with us on providing some money through the Department of Energy to make both properties more energy efficient. And this was a program I didn't know that existed, you know, but the Department of Energy has all these things with, you know, if you do retrofitting of lighting, and we also had to do, they had money to help us do drought-resistant planting since we're in a drought in California. But this mayor, who is a dynamic Latino mayor who is 38 years old, was just very proactive in working with us and finding the resources, which he was very, you know, found federal resources to support us. So I think it starts at the local level with the right kind of leadership. And I know you are that kind of leader in Baltimore, and that's what we need. I mean, many communities don't have the resources, but if you've got a good person in the helm, they will help find those resources.
And I'll just add that money drives innovation. It's a funny thing. And I think that if the federal, state, and local players get together and harmonize the requirements, I think through, again, a clear articulation of outcomes that you'd like to see accomplished, that can drive some of the local behavior. And at the same time, the communities are going to have to come together and stop fighting over small battles, because at the end of the day, you might win that small battle, but you'll end up with the same conditions that you've been struggling with for decades. So it's really about people coming together toward enforcing and implementing a vision that really moves and lifts all boats.
And I think one of the paths of least resistance in Prince George's, because I think the call of the question was a lot of political, is those transit-oriented development sites that are still largely undeveloped in Prince George's County. And I think it's been my experience anyway, that when you're able to address the fact that you have an answer to the traffic congestion issues when you go with the higher density with the transit-oriented development, I think is a huge help to allaying concerns of existing residents to the greater density.
We're out of time. Join me in thanking this panel for coming to participate here.